In 1950, the producers of The Ed Sullivan Show in New York decided to book Edith Piaf. The decision was made the way booking decisions were made on variety television in the early 1950s, with a reasonably clear sense of what you were getting and a reasonably calibrated expectation of what the audience would receive. What they knew about Piaf was what the international entertainment press had been communicating for several years. A French singer, famous in France and in European cabaret circuits, who had made a successful impression in New York concert venues beginning in 1947. Internationally significant, a prestige booking. The kind of international act that a variety program with the ambitions The Ed Sullivan Show had needed to demonstrate that it was operating at the top level of the entertainment world. What they expected was a polished performance from a capable international performer, a 3 to 4 minute segment, something the American television audience at home would appreciate as an encounter with European culture, exotic in the positive sense, interesting, competently executed. The singer would appear, she would sing a song or two in French, she would take the appropriate bow, Ed Sullivan would say the appropriate words, and the program would move on to the next segment. The audience at home would feel they had seen something sophisticated and perhaps slightly unfamiliar. The network would have demonstrated its international reach. Everyone involved would have received what the booking had been designed to produce. This was a reasonable expectation. It was wrong. Not in the sense that the performance failed, the performance did not fail. It was wrong in the more interesting sense. The expectation had not been built for what the performance actually was, and what the performance actually was exceeded the category the booking had placed it in by a margin that nobody on the production team had prepared for. The Ed Sullivan Show in 1950 was broadcast live from CBS Studio 50 on Broadway, a theater converted for television, the same kind of intimate performance space that Piaf had been working in since the mid-1930s, with the addition of cameras and a transmission infrastructure that sent the performance into millions of American homes simultaneously. Television was still establishing itself as a medium in 1950. The networks were learning what worked on the new screen, what translated from the theater and concert hall into the living room, what the camera did to performers, and what performers did to the camera. The production team on The Ed Sullivan Show was among the most experienced in American television. They had booked many performers. They had a good sense of what to expect. They did not have the vocabulary to anticipate what Edith Piaf was. The studio was prepared. The cameras were in position. The audience in the theater seats was settled. And somewhere in the backstage corridor of CBS Studio 50, Edith Piaf was waiting to be introduced. This is the second rehook, because what actually happened when Piaf sang on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1950 is not what the word television suggests happened. She was introduced. She walked to the microphone at center stage. The cameras were on her. In the theater, the audience in their seats was quiet. In millions of American living rooms, people were watching their television sets and seeing a small French woman in a plain black dress walk to a microphone on a Broadway stage. She sang in French. The American television audience in those living rooms did not speak French. They had no vocabulary for the chanson réaliste tradition. They had not been to Paris. They had not seen her perform in the Olympia or the ABC or any of the rooms where her reputation had been built. They were watching a foreign performer sing a foreign song in a foreign language. And what they were experiencing was not what they had expected, and was not what the producers had expected, and was not, truthfully, what anyone had thought to predict. This is the second payoff, and it is the thing that explains why the response was what it was. The voice carried what the words were saying without the words. The French language was not accessible to the American television audience watching in their living rooms, but the voice was not actually dependent on the language being understood. What the chanson réaliste tradition had always done, what the best practitioners of it had always understood, was that the voice, if it was doing what it was supposed to do, conveyed the emotional content of the song independently of whether the listener understood the lyrics. The language was the channel, not the content. The content was the quality of voice and what it was doing with the song. What happened in American living rooms in 1950 when Piaf sang was the same thing that had happened in French cabarets and concert halls since the mid-1930s. The voice arrived, and the listener received it. Not intellectually, not linguistically. In the specific register where music operates when it is working at the level it is supposed to work at. The register that precedes language, and that language is an imperfect attempt to describe. They did not understand the words, they felt the song. And what they felt was something that American television in 1950 had not previously given them. The variety format, the show's usual acts, the performers who preceded and followed her, these were excellent in their categories. They were not this. They had not produced this quality of reception in an audience watching through a small screen in a living room. Piaf had done something in that medium that the medium had not been understood to be capable of producing. To understand why the producer's expectation was wrong, you have to understand what Edith Piaf was by 1950, and what the television medium was in the same year, and why those two things combined in a way that nobody on either side of the camera had fully prepared for. American television in 1950 was in the process of discovering what it could and could not do. The medium had proven, in the early years of its wide adoption, that it could carry certain kinds of performances very well. Comedy worked on television, news worked, sporting events worked. Musical acts that played well on a small screen worked. What the medium had not fully demonstrated by 1950 was what it did with a performer whose principal tool was the relationship between her voice and the space the voice was filling, a relationship that had been built in cabarets and concert halls, in rooms where the physical presence of the performer, the physical proximity of the audience, and the specific acoustic properties of the space were all part of what the performance required. Piaf's performing tradition was built on exactly this kind of relationship. She had been performing since the mid-1930s in spaces that ranged from street corners to the Olympia, spaces that varied enormously in their physical scale, but that all shared the fundamental characteristic of being rooms where her voice arrived in the air of the room and was received by people physically present in that same air. She had developed, over 15 years of performing in those conditions, a specific quality of stage presence that was understood by everyone who had seen her as something that did not originate in technique and could not be fully explained by it. The voice did something to the rooms it filled. The rooms did something to the voice. This is the first payoff, and it is the specific thing the television producers had not accounted for. Television was supposed to diminish this quality, The camera reduces a physical presence to a two-dimensional image on a screen measured in inches. The audio compression of 1950 broadcast technology reduced the full range of what a voice was capable of producing in a room to a narrower band, transmitted through the small speaker of a home television set. By every reasonable calculation, the medium should have made Piaf smaller. It should have translated her into a version of herself that the reduction of the medium required: competent, interesting, somewhat diminished. But here is what nobody on the production team had accounted for. The television camera, which reduces most performers, did something different with Piaf. It removed everything except the essential thing. The stage, the theater, the physical space, the accumulated atmosphere of a Paris concert hall, all of it was stripped away. What remained was the face and the voice, and the face and the voice, stripped of everything else, were more concentrated, not less, than they had been in the rooms that surrounded them. The television camera, in 1950, had never encountered a performer for whom the reduction to face and voice was not a diminishment, but an intensification. Piaf's entire performing tradition was built on the principle that the voice was the essential thing and everything else was in service to it. The camera had removed the everything else. What was left was precisely what she had always been. What happened after the broadcast was the kind of thing the entertainment industry recognized as a signal, even before the mechanisms for measuring it had fully developed. The phone calls to the network, the letters from viewers, the specific quality of feedback that comes not from people who appreciated a performance in the ordinary sense, but from people who were trying to account for why the performance had reached them in a way they did not expect and could not fully explain. The American television audience had not expected to feel something watching a French woman sing in French on a variety program. They felt something. They wrote to say so. Not the polished language of people who could name what they had experienced, the terminology of music criticism, the vocabulary of the Chanson tradition, but the language of people who had encountered something in their living rooms that had produced an effect they could not account for, and wanted to communicate to someone who might understand it. Piaf returned to the Ed Sullivan Show. She appeared on other American television programs. Each appearance produced variations of the same result: an audience that did not have the cultural framework the performance came from, receiving the performance anyway, through the specific channel that bypassed the framework. The voice was the channel. The channel worked. This is the main payoff, and it is the thing that makes the 1950 Ed Sullivan appearance more than a footnote in the history of international television. What the producers had not anticipated, what nobody on the American side of the booking had accounted for, was that the barrier they thought existed between a French chanson performer and an American television audience watching in their living rooms was not the barrier they thought it was. The language was real. The cultural distance was real. The unfamiliarity of the tradition was real. None of those barriers turned out to be the relevant barrier. The relevant question was not whether the American television audience understood chanson. The relevant question was whether the voice was doing what it was supposed to do. And if the voice was doing what it was supposed to do, the question of whether the listener spoke French was, in the end, secondary to the question of whether they could hear. They could hear, and they did. The producers of The Ed Sullivan Show in 1950 had booked an international act, a prestige segment for a variety program. What they had booked, without knowing it, was the thing that survived every barrier that the booking had assumed would limit it. The language barrier, the cultural barrier, the medium barrier, the reduction of a live performing presence to a two-dimensional image on a small screen in an American living room. She sang in French. Nobody in the living rooms understood the words. Nobody who was listening misunderstood what the song was about. The producers had booked an international novelty. What they had aired was a lesson in what a voice could do when it was operating at the level it had been built for. The language was French. The medium was a 1950 television broadcast. The audience was American, in their living rooms on an ordinary evening. None of those conditions mattered in the way the producers had assumed they would matter. The voice arrived. The voice did what it did. And the people who had not expected to receive it received it anyway, through a screen measured in inches, in a room where they had not chosen to experience anything unusual that evening. That is what made the broadcast significant. Not that it happened, but that it worked. Every condition was wrong. The voice was right.